Have you ever wondered why the people who hurt the kindest hearts often seem perfectly fine at first, but then months or even years later, something about it begins to haunt them? Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in the middle of the night, when their mind replays conversations they once brushed off. In a random moment when they hear your name, and their voice pauses for half a second longer than it should. In the strange discomfort they feel when someone new treats them with the same sincerity you once did. And suddenly, something unsettles them. Because deep down, there's a psychological truth that many people don't realize until it's too late. Betraying someone who genuinely cared about you leaves a very specific kind of imprint on the human mind. Not because the betrayed person demanded revenge, not because karma magically appears overnight, but because the human brain is wired in a way that struggles to forget the people who treated us with real sincerity, especially when we responded with deception. And if you've ever been the person who gave your loyalty, your patience, your understanding, only to watch someone take it for granted, lie to you, or slowly pull away without explanation, then you might have asked yourself a painful question. Did they ever care? Or did they simply move on without thinking twice? The psychology behind this is far more complex than most people imagine, because the truth is, people who betray a genuinely good heart often carry something with them afterward. Something subtle. Something that lingers longer than they expected. And once you understand why this happens, you'll start to recognize patterns in human behavior that suddenly make a lot more sense. Before we go further, it's important to understand what this conversation is really about. This isn't about blaming people or encouraging bitterness. Human relationships are complicated. People make mistakes. They act out of insecurity, fear, loneliness, ego, or simple immaturity. Sometimes they hurt others without fully understanding the emotional consequences of their actions. The purpose of understanding these patterns is awareness. Because when you understand the psychological mechanisms behind betrayal, guilt, and emotional memory, you stop taking certain things personally. You start seeing behavior more clearly. And most importantly, you learn how to protect your own emotional well-being without becoming cold or cynical. Healthy emotional intelligence means recognizing patterns without losing your humanity. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people believe that the person who gets hurt is the one who carries the emotional burden. But psychology often reveals something surprising. When someone betrays a person who treated them with genuine kindness, the mind creates a kind of cognitive tension that doesn't always disappear easily. In psychology, there's a concept called cognitive dissonance. This happens when a person's actions conflict with the image they have of themselves. Most people like to believe they are decent, fair, and morally reasonable. Even people who make questionable decisions still tend to view themselves as good people at their core. But when someone knowingly betrays a person who was sincere with them, that internal self-image begins to clash with reality. At first, many people avoid thinking about it. They distract themselves. They justify their behavior. They tell themselves stories like, it wasn't that serious, or they were too sensitive, or things just didn't work out. But the human mind is very good at remembering emotional contradictions, especially when the other person handled the situation with dignity instead of revenge. Have you ever noticed something strange that sometimes happens after a relationship ends badly? In the beginning, the person who betrayed trust may seem distant, cold, or completely unaffected. But later, something changes. Maybe they suddenly start watching your social media stories more frequently. Reach out with a casual message that feels oddly hesitant. Maybe they ask mutual friends how you're doing. And when they finally see you again in person, their behavior feels slightly different. There's often a subtle shift in tone. Eye contact becomes a little shorter. Conversations feel slightly cautious. Sometimes they overcompensate with friendliness. Other times they seem unusually quiet. These small behavioral shifts reveal something deeper happening internally, because the mind has started connecting the memory of their actions with the emotional reality of who you actually were. And this realization often happens slowly, not in one dramatic moment, but through dozens of small reminders. Maybe they meet someone new who initially seems exciting, but eventually behaves in ways that feel shallow or self-centered. Maybe they notice how rare genuine loyalty actually is. Way you used to listen when they talked about their problems late at night. Maybe they recall how patient you were during moments when they were difficult, distant, or emotionally unavailable. And that's when the psychological contrast begins. Because now, they're comparing two emotional experiences, the sincerity they once had, and the consequences of losing it. But this is where most people misunderstand something important. The feeling that haunts them isn't always obvious regret. Sometimes it appears as something more subtle, a quiet awareness that they mishandled something meaningful. The human brain stores emotionally significant relationships in very deep memory structures. Even when people move on, start new relationships, or change environments, those earlier emotional connections remain part of their psychological landscape. And certain triggers can bring them back unexpectedly. Song. A familiar place. A conversation topic that reminds them of you. Or even seeing someone else treat another person with the same kindness you once showed them. These moments can create sudden flashes of reflection. And often, those reflections come with a complicated mix of emotions. Guilt, curiosity, nostalgia, sometimes even admiration. But this emotional complexity creates an internal conflict. Because acknowledging that someone treated you well while you treated them poorly requires a level of self-honesty that many people struggle with. So instead of openly admitting regret, people often display mixed signals. Have you ever noticed how someone who hurt you might behave strangely if you reconnect months later? At first, they might seem excited to talk. Their messages come quickly. They ask questions about your life. There's warmth in their tone. But then suddenly, their energy changes. Replies become shorter. They take longer to respond. The conversation drifts into neutral topics. And sometimes they disappear again for days. This push and pull behavior often confuses people. But psychologically, it makes sense. Because interacting with you activates two opposing emotional forces inside them. One part of their mind remembers the comfort, familiarity, and sincerity that existed before everything fell apart. But another part of their mind remembers the role they played in breaking that connection. And those two realities create tension. So they move closer for a moment, then they pull back again. Not necessarily because they want to hurt you, but because being reminded of that emotional contrast is uncomfortable. Here's another detail that people rarely talk about. Behavior often changes depending on the social setting. Who betrayed your trust in a group environment? Watch carefully how their behavior shifts. When other people are around, they may act unusually friendly. Sometimes even overly friendly. They might laugh a little louder at your jokes. They might go out of their way to start conversations. From the outside, it looks completely normal. But if you pay attention to subtle cues, you may notice something interesting. Their eye contact might flick away quickly during certain moments. Their voice may soften slightly when they mention the past, or they might avoid specific topics that remind them of how things ended. Now compare that with a one-on-one interaction. In private conversations, the tone often becomes more cautious, more reflective. Sometimes there are longer pauses before they answer certain questions. Sometimes they bring up small memories from the past, almost testing whether those moments still mean something to you. And sometimes there's a noticeable shift when another person enters the room. the emotional atmosphere changes. Because now they are aware of being observed. These subtle behavioral contrasts reveal an internal balancing act. They want connection, but they also want to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. And this leads to one of the most confusing emotional patterns people experience after betrayal: the hot and cold dynamic. One day they seem warm, nostalgic, and curious. Another day they appear distant, distracted, or emotionally unavailable. This inconsistency isn't always manipulation. Often it's internal conflict. Part of them recognizes that they once had something genuine with you. Another part of them feels uneasy about facing what they did to lose it. And so the mind tries to maintain emotional distance while still holding on to a connection, where something deeper happens over time. Life has a way of providing psychological comparisons. As people go through new relationships, new friendships, and new emotional experiences, they slowly develop a clearer understanding of what sincerity actually looks like. And sometimes, that realization arrives quietly. Maybe they're sitting in a conversation with someone who seems charming but inconsistent. Maybe they notice someone avoiding responsibility in ways that remind them uncomfortably of their past behavior. Maybe they experience being taken for granted themselves. These experiences can trigger reflection. Not always immediate regret, but a slow shift in perspective. Suddenly, memories of you begin to look different. Conversations they once dismissed begin to feel more meaningful. Moments they took for granted begin to carry emotional weight. This is why some people eventually reach out years later with messages that feel strangely reflective. Not dramatic apologies, not emotional confessions, but small acknowledgments. Something like, "I was thinking about that time we talked about traveling," or "I came across something that reminded me of you." On the surface, these messages seem casual, but psychologically, they often represent unfinished emotional processing. The mind revisiting a chapter that never fully made sense. But here's the most important insight in all of this. Whether someone eventually reflects on their behavior or not, should never become the center of your emotional focus. Because your integrity was never defined by their awareness. It was defined by your actions, your honesty, your willingness to care sincerely. People who possess genuine kindness often underestimate how rare that quality actually is. In a world where many interactions are transactional, distracted, or emotionally guarded, sincere loyalty stands out more than people realize. And even when it isn't fully appreciated in the moment, it leaves an imprint. Not because you demanded recognition, but because authenticity is psychologically memorable. The real lesson here isn't about waiting for someone to regret losing you. The real lesson is understanding that maintaining your own integrity protects your peace of mind in ways that retaliation never could. When you walk away from betrayal without becoming bitter, you create something powerful. Clarity. You stop chasing explanations from people who may not yet understand themselves. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone who couldn't recognize it at the time. And you begin redirecting your energy toward relationships that align with your values. Healthy boundaries are not walls. They are filters. They help you recognize who deserves deeper access to your time, your trust, and your emotional openness. And when people learn that your kindness is accompanied by self-respect, something interesting happens. The dynamic shifts, because genuine kindness combined with strong boundaries creates a presence that others naturally respect. But this is where many people get it wrong. They assume that maintaining dignity after betrayal means pretending the experience never affected them. In reality, emotional awareness means acknowledging the pain, learning from the experience, and choosing not to let it harden your character. Pain can teach you discernment. It can sharpen your ability to recognize sincerity versus manipulation. It can help you notice subtle behavioral patterns earlier, like the way someone responds when you express vulnerability, the way their tone changes when responsibility enters the conversation, the way they behave when no one else is watching. Small details reveal far more about character than dramatic words ever could. And once you start noticing them, relationships begin to feel clearer. You invest your energy more wisely. You recognize emotional red flags sooner. You value consistency over empty intensity. Because the most reliable indicator of sincerity isn't how strongly someone expresses affection in one moment. It's how consistently their actions align with their words over time. So if you've ever given your loyalty to someone who didn't treat it with the care it deserved, remember this.